Hey everybody, welcome to another video episode of OK Talks. For anybody who's listening to the audio version on one of the podcast platforms, the show is now in fact up on YouTube if you prefer video. I am your host, Oliver Kendall. I'm a lifelong political nerd with a background in international relations and security policy who's worked in domestic US politics and also had the good fortune to have visited and lived in a number of countries besides just my own. Channeling those experiences, I do my best on this show to both translate what's going on in my own country for my non-US listeners and to help shed some light for the folks back home on some events of note going on in the rest of the world. It's an insane week. There's way too much happening with the convention and everything to do like a full episode talking about all of the stuff at the convention, although I will say, right now, I'm feeling damn proud to be a Democrat. I'm feeling super grateful to President Biden for his lifetime of service to America and the world. I'm feeling happy to see that recognized so much at the convention when I feel like he usually gets so much less credit than he deserves. And I'm feeling super excited about the Harris-walz ticket. I could do an episode just talking about how well the convention has gone because, damn, our buddy has apparently learned how to run a way tighter ship and put on a show better than we have in the past, and I love to see it. But as I've often been in a position on this show of at least trying to introduce a little nuance into various of the different echo chambers that exist around the whole Israel-gaza anti-Semitism conversation, I feel like I should weigh in on a couple of things that I've seen lately around stuff to do with the convention and the election when it comes to this particular issue. So I decided to yet again do a quick sort of semi-off-the-cuff episode and just talk quickly, sort of react to some things that I've seen happen in this space lately in a way that is, I hope, helpful, but I think more even than usual. Also, this time runs the risk, today at least, based on what I'm planning to talk about, of having something in this episode to offend almost everyone among the diverse ideological spectrum that forms the audience of OK Talks. And it is diverse, I should say. I'm serious. Almost every time that I talk about like this set of issues, I get feedback from different parts of my audience saying I've been too mean to Benjamin Netanyahu, and like doing that, being as critical of him as I tend to be, contributes to the factually deficient and like unfair anti-Israel narrative that's been seeded in a lot of the mainstream press lately in the NGO space, leveraging anti-Israel sentiment for fundraising purposes. Both of which, incidentally, are also things I've criticized a lot. And then on the other hand, I get feedback from other people, other parts of the audience who have trouble hearing me give a rhetorical defense of Israel or criticize the bad journalism around the war in the face of just seeing scenes of horror and suffering as a result of Israeli airstrikes. And to be fair, I have also fairly often been critical of bad things I think the Israelis have done, especially the like gross fascistic far right end of Netanyahu's government. But bottom line, I have a very diverse audience when it comes to this particular set of issues, and I'm guessing that I'll have at least something in this quick episode to annoy almost everyone in the audience, wherever you are on this issue. So buckle up, I guess. I just hope most of you can accept not always agreeing with everything I say in exchange for knowing that you're getting my authentic analysis. Perhaps not the best audience growth strategy in an age of narrowcasting, but I just hope that most of my listeners can accept not always immediately agreeing with me as a fair trade-off for knowing, that I'm giving my authentic analysis on OK Talks. Speaking of audience growth, I should say before I potentially piss anyone off, do be sure to hit subscribe or follow the channel or whatever it's called on whichever platform you listen. That way you don't miss the next episode, and it's also helpful for the algorithm. Also helpful, if you feel like doing me a solid, hit like, leave a comment, and most importantly, share this show with anybody you think might get something out of it. Thanks, as always, to anybody who already has. Thanks in advance to anyone else who will. So, I've talked in previous episodes about the actual war in the Middle East. I don't think I'm going to do that too much today. I've talked about the dramatic rise in anti-Semitism in much of the world since the war started. Don't think I'm going to do too much of that today either. This quick take is more to roll my eyes at some activist types in various of the different ideological lanes of the Israel-Palestine conflict that I laid out back in episode 63 of OK Talks. For the record, if you haven't heard that episode, go listen to it. I really do stand by it as a good roadmap, I think, to understanding the sort of multiple different ideological camps when it comes to this conflict. Also, if you're curious, it does, help, I think, frame relatively decently where I'm coming from and where I fit into that whole spectrum. So, right, first, to focus in on the like anti-Israel protester movement thing. This group, and for the record, I always have to just throw in this caveat. I am not referring here in general to anyone who ever protests against the Israeli government. I am not referring right now to like anyone who ever calls for a ceasefire or protests against the Netanyahu regime or criticizes the actions of that government, etc. No, no. I'm referring right now specifically to the like anti-Zionist movement. That is to say, to the people who seek to delegitimize the right of Israel to even exist, to the people who casually throw around words like settler or colonist or whatever to refer to Jews who are indigenous to the Middle East living in their own homeland. I'm referring to those people, and frankly, at this point, I'm also referring to any among the anti-Israel protesters who can't seem to bring themselves, when asked, to condemn members of their own movement who, let's say, engage in blatant anti-Semitism or openly support Hamas. And yes, there are plenty of people who fit into both of those categories, unfortunately. Now, I'm not talking, as I say, about anyone in general who protests against the Israeli government. I'm talking about people who are anti-Semitic and whose whose protest is against the mere existence of a Jewish state. Right. So like in terms of that like anti-Israel, anti-Zionist, anti-right of the state of Israel to even exist wing of the sort of protest movement lately, there's been a number of sort of extra gross things in that space. One of those things is that, frankly, the nomination of Kamala Harris has created a split, let's say, among some of that movement in the form of a number of progressive uh, black allies of that part of the sort of anti-Israel protest movement have suddenly run into the problem of there being some rather serious anti-black racism among parts of that movement because a number of those folks I'm referring to were rather excited about the imminent nomination of a black woman, of America's first black woman to be the president, whereas a number of the sort of anti-Israel protester types are like, how dare you be happy about Kamala Harris being the nominee? Because she also, doesn't perfectly mirror our position on this issue, which others have spoken about this at greater length. I not being super in the world of like the intricacies of the anti-Israel protester movement. Like I haven't like super followed all of these fights, but I think it has been revealing of yet another sort of dark underbelly to parts of this movement, where there are certainly lots of anti-Semitism in parts of the movement, and evidently there's also some anti-black racism as well. Another thing about this movement that lately has had me really wanting to throw shade in some form is the fact that that movement, which purports to be concerned about the welfare of Palestinian civilians or protesting Israeli genocide or something along those lines, doesn't seem to have any interest in taking their message to the Republicans, a group of people who are a lot less inclined, frankly, to be sympathetic to their perspective than the Democrats are. And it is interesting to me, one might just say, that so many of the hardcore anti-Israel protesters are so bent on showing up to troll Democratic events and heckle Democratic speakers and protest outside the Democratic convention. But nary a one showed up at the Republican convention. I don't know of any Republican events that have been heckled by these people. Another thing that I have trouble dealing with in the context of the sort of anti-Israel protest movement and its appearance around the Democratic convention is the fact that if you're in the streets calling for a ceasefire now, which at this point a lot of these protesters are not calling for that. I'll get into that in a minute. They're calling for other things that have a little bit less to do with the war ending and a little bit more to do with basically just giving a giant middle finger to the mere existence of the Jewish state. But For a long time, the claim among the anti-Israel protest movement was that they were calling for a ceasefire. Are these people even aware of the fact that the Biden administration has been working tirelessly to achieve a ceasefire for months, and the other day basically just got the Israelis to sign on to one? And now, yet again, it looks like Hamas is about to reject that deal and walk away. On earlier episodes of OK Talks, I've talked about the fact that on multiple occasions in the last couple of months, there have been situations where ceasefire deals are on the table, and then Hamas has torpedoed them. And it looks like that's about to happen again, in a way that's worse and more problematic than it has been in the past. And I'm just curious if folks that are outside screaming genocide Joe and killer Kamala and all this sort of nonsense are aware of the fact that because of the Biden-Harris administration, there's a ceasefire deal on the table that the Israelis have accepted and that the terrorist organization on the other side looks like it's about to walk away from. Maybe they don't know. Maybe they're unaware of that fact. I think fact and detail knowing was never a huge part of this protest movement, but maybe they just don't know about that in this case. Or they do know and just don't care. Because for a lot of these folks, the goal is not actually for the war to end. The goal is for the war to continue, but for Israel to lose, for the state of Israel to be destroyed and have its entire population either expelled or exterminated. Maybe it's that. Think I'm being hyperbolic? Here, take a listen to this group of jackasses protesting outside the Democratic National Convention over the last couple of days.
We don't want no two states. We want all the 48.
We don't want no two states. We want 1948. Let's just take a second to get clarity about what that actually means. A lot of things happened in 1948, but in very short, and with regards specifically to what these people are rhyming about, in 1948, the UN offered up a partition plan to share the land once occupied by the Ottoman Empire and then occupied by the British. That plan divided what was then called British Mandatory Palestine between the Jews who already lived there, by the way. The idea that they all just moved there in the 40s is bullshit and propaganda. So this UN partition plan divided the land between the Jews and the Arabs. And this UN plan, by the way, gave the Arabs more than they probably should have gotten, frankly, or are ever going to get now. But okay. The Jews accepted this deal that was worse for them than anything that would come up now. The Arabs did not. And then the armies of 5 neighboring Arab countries invaded in an attempt to exterminate or expel the Jews who lived there. They failed, obviously, which resulted in the Jews getting and declaring independence in roughly the territory that is now Israel proper, while rather than setting up an independent Palestinian state on anything close to the territory that the UN had spelled out, the Jordanians occupied what is now the West Bank, the Egyptians occupied what is now the Gaza Strip, and the Syrians occupied what is now the Golan Heights. So when people chant, "We don't want no two states, we want 1948," they're calling for a do-over of that particular attempt to exterminate or expel the Jews of Israel. Yeah, I don't know why they think that it would go better for them a second time around, but yeah. It's not about peace. It's not about a ceasefire. It's not about a heartfelt concern for Palestinian Arab civilians. We don't want no two states. We want 1948 is about attempting to relitigate violently the mere existence of Israel. It is the Middle East equivalent of the Dixie sore loser Confederate lost cause narrative in the United States. Now, again, just to reiterate this one more time to hopefully head off some of the potential pushback, are all of pro-Palestinian demonstrators engaging in this? No, don't mean to imply that. That is not the case. But there is a lot of this in this movement, and it really does feel like the good ones, the ones who are not necessarily chanting that sort of genocidal slogan in the street, the ones who are just out in the street because they are genuinely worried about Palestinian civilians, it really does seem that way too many of those people have way too hard a time condemning this other shit. And the longer they go without distancing themselves from active, affirmative, repeated calls for genocide of the Israeli people, the harder it is for me to feel like extending the benefit of the doubt. Speaking of bad behavior in this movement, with the protests themselves outside the DNC being, well, kind of pathetic so far, as Dana Milbank wrote about in the Washington Post recently, those salivating over the prospect of a recreation of the violence and chaos of 1968 have thus far been disappointed. Prominent figures in the uncommitted movement, that is to say, the movement that went on during the primary to try to get people to vote uncommitted instead of voting for Biden, basically as a protest vote against Biden not abandoning 75 years of existing American foreign policy precedent. With the protests having not been quite what they hoped for, leaders of this movement have now basically been reduced to bitching on Twitter that none of these people got a speaking role at the convention. Their argument seems to be that since the parents of an American Israeli hostage held captive right now by Hamas after his arm got blown off in the attacks of October 7th, a speech by his parents, which, by the way, was quite moving, that they, the uncommitted movement, should get to have someone speak also. Except that Hirsch Goldberg, Poland's parents, are not like fire-breathing anti-Arab Likudniks or something. They are pro-Israel and pro-Palestine and pro-peace. The same certainly could not be said for anybody that the uncommitted movement wanted to be given a speaking slot. The notion that the Democratic Party is like obligated to platform someone from this fringy anti-Israel, anti-Biden protest movement. Okay, this just fundamentally misunderstands the purpose of a political convention. Like, the goal here is to inspire people, unite the party behind our candidate, and prepare to win the elections this fall. It's not open mic night at the local town council meeting or like a Yelp review page or something. I mean, Kamala Harris has already donated her insanely valuable time to meet with and listen to leaders of this movement. And then when she did that, a bunch of them then turned around afterward and repeatedly heckled her speech in Michigan last week. Why the hell would the party put someone on the stage at the convention in prime time to presumably trash the administration for not abandoning a key ally by, again, overturning 75 years of existing American foreign policy precedent? An administration, by the way, in which our nominee is, I think, like the sitting vice president or something. Like, what are they going to do? Go outside, get one of the protesters to come in and wave their Hezbollah flag around on the stage or something? I mean, look, the Democratic Party leadership is expressly, obviously committed to trying to bring this war to a close, as they should be. The president and the secretary of state are working around the clock on this, as they should be. That does not mean that we as a party have like a responsibility to platform some hypothetical speaker who, based on every shred of past evidence from this movement, would then use that opportunity to trash us on live TV in our own house to the direct benefit of Donald Trump and the Republicans, who, again, these people, interestingly enough, don't seem to have any sort of problem with. It's almost as though the overarching goal here is actually to just mess with the Democrats in order to instead get someone else elected who, through a toxic combination of malevolence and incompetence, will bring about the destruction of the United States and the liberal Western order. Sure does look that way sometimes, which is also why people have at times questioned with some reason the sources of funding of some of this movement. Or as Harris put it last week when she got sick of being heckled in her speech,
and he intends to end the Affordable Care Act. You know what? If you want Donald Trump to win, then say that, otherwise I'm speaking.
yeah. Now, having thrown a bunch of shade at the like anti-Israel activists vis-a-vis the Democratic Convention, I also have some gripes at the moment with the much smaller, to be fair, usually less obnoxious and unreasonable, like pro-Israel activist online community. Now, this group of activists, at least the ones that I'm aware of, tends to be a decent bit less radical than their like anti-Israel counterparts. I mean, don't get me wrong. I know that there are Israelis who exist who will say things like, there already is a Palestinian state, it's called Jordan. And unfortunately, several people who seem to operate along those lines currently sit in Netanyahu's own government, as I've complained about a whole bunch of times, which is terrible. But this This is hardly like a huge protest movement all over the West. Like, there have been multiple huge protests in the streets and on college campuses where a critical mass of the protesters are calling for the violent elimination of the state of Israel. I am not aware of any such demonstration in America or anywhere else in the West where like Israel supporters like go out and call for the violent expulsion of the Palestinian Arabs from and the annexation of the occupied territories. Like, most of the sort of online activists pro-Israel community that I'm aware of, like this, community of people online that is defensive of Israel, is much more reasonable, tends to, to be supportive of a two-state solution as opposed to the like anti-Arab one-state lane that I spelled out in episode 63, are at least willing to recognize the suffering of the Palestinian civilians in Gaza and want it to end. But I've been seeing parts of this group start to turn on Biden recently for not being defensive enough of Israel, and I just don't have a lot of patience for this. Like, I get it. This is a group of people who are tired and angry about having to like constantly push back on extremely dominant false narratives generated by sloppy press coverage, as I've discussed in previous episodes of OK Talks. Not to mention a sense of profound vulnerability that comes from knowing that there are tens, if not hundreds of millions of people on Earth who believe that they should be genocided out of existence for the crime of being Jewish. And, frankly, the sense of pretty profound betrayal that comes from the realization that a bunch of people that they thought that, were their allies apparently are not. But some of the criticism of President Biden coming from this group I just find really hard to take. I mean, granted, part of that is just because I find most criticism of Biden to be hard to take, but like Joe Biden has been an incredibly loyal friend to Israel. He is, I believe, the first American president to visit Israel at a time of war. He has completely rejected calls to throw Israel under the bus at all at a time when, frankly, it would perhaps have been politically expedient, both domestically and internationally, for him to have done so. He's demonstrated incredible humanity toward the hostage families, and frankly is quite a bit more popular in Israel than is Israel's own elected head of government, and for good reason. Biden, he's just loyal. He was unbelievably loyal as vice president to Barack Obama. He's been quite loyal to his own vice president, who frankly now has the best shot she's ever going to have to be president because he set her up for it and handed it off to her. Not to discount the awesome campaign that she's running for the record, but like Biden definitely helped put her in this position. Biden has also, along those lines, been very loyal to Israel. And that being the case, the criticism that he's getting right now from, some of the like pro-Israel activists feels nitpicky and in bad faith, and quite frankly, bugs the living shit out of me. A bunch of people basically taking one line of Biden's speech at the convention out of context to like create angry social media content complaining about it. Like here, okay, so, just so you understand, here is the actual line from the speech.
Those protesters out in the street, they have a point. A lot of innocent people are being killed on both sides.
Now, okay, if you watch that in good faith and extend Biden the benefit of the doubt, to which he is absolutely entitled in this context, it's pretty clear. He's attempting to acknowledge the protest movement and find common ground over concern about civilian casualties, which is not an unreasonable point. Whether or not you think the numbers of civilian casualties that we've been getting from Hamas are credible, even a lower number would still be a tragically high number of civilians dying, which is something that we should all be deeply disturbed by. It is not, as I say, an unreasonable point to make, and making it does not in any way mean one isn't supportive of Israel's right to defend itself against terrorist groups bent on its destruction. But like, okay, a bunch of these folks that I mentioned earlier have basically been like, the protesters have a point? You mean these protesters? Cut to an image of like the most like gross Hamas cosplayer terrorist supporting like jihadist genocidal anti-Semites you could find within the protests waving around their Hamas, Hezbollah, or Islamic Republic regime flags. And like, okay, I get it. This one line by Biden provided a convenient jumping off point to riff on the genuine issue of just how nuts some of this anti-Israel protest movement has gotten. But I'm sorry, clearly that's not what Biden meant. He certainly deserves the benefit of the doubt that it wasn't what he meant. Like, Joe Biden deserves better than this sort of bad faith attack. Like, okay, do I sometimes wish that Biden had been a little more explicit about attacking the nastier elements of this protest movement over the last number of months? Yeah. Yeah, I do. I mean, sure, I wish Congressman Richie Torres had been writing President Biden's tweets about this. But Biden has condemned anti-Semitism among the protests and on campus specifically. People in his administration have been pushing for clearer guidelines on anti-Semitism. He has, in all the ways that I described before, and in many others, stood shoulder to shoulder with Israel, if not with Benjamin Netanyahu. This is not like a guy who was up there on the stage like, oh, hey, you know what? Let's get those protesters from outside into the convention hall, from the river to the sea, man. Ah, shit, I forgot my Hezbollah flag at home. No. As Biden himself would say, come on, man. He's earned the benefit of the doubt. He's earned not being nitpicked to death like this. Also, he's the president of the United States, speaking on behalf of another person running to be president of the United States. Many citizens of the United States, myself included, agree with the statement, quote, a lot of innocent people are being killed, unquote, and are deeply troubled by that fact. It's not exactly an absurd thing to say. The fact that he name-checked the protesters in the context of saying that, yeah, I don't love it either. But lighting your hair on fire over those words, over the words, quote, those protesters outside have a point, unquote, without taking into account the second half of the sentence in which that quote appeared, is just, yeah, nitpicky. Feels in bad faith to me. Also, like, I think I have pretty well established on this show my credibility when it comes to criticizing anti-Semitism coming from the extreme left. But this notion that that's coming from the Democratic Party as a whole, as opposed to just like the gross horseshoe fringe, I'm sorry, but no. The protesters accusing Biden and Israel of genocide and calling for Israel to be destroyed, ironic as always given the whole genocide thing, those people, they were outside. They were outside protesting against our party. Something they, again, a message that they never seem to think that the Republicans need to hear from them. The vast majority of Democrats, certainly myself included, are horrified by the suffering in Gaza and want it to end, but also, although most of us understand that Benjamin Netanyahu's government is without a doubt the worst government in the history of the state of Israel, we also recognize that Hamas is ultimately to blame for the horrific situation in Gaza. And our platform, the platform that we just reaffirmed at the convention, reaffirmed our commitment to Israel's right to exist in peace and security. Although we apparently decided to not give Congresswoman Rashida Tlaib a primetime speaking slot to spew misinformation, even her friend Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez referenced the need to free the Israeli hostages in her speech. Speaking of hostages, one of the more moving moments of the convention so far was when the parents of Hirsch Goldberg Poland, an Israeli-American hostage still being held by Hamas, spoke about the need to free the hostages. The entire convention, when they did, the entire convention hall erupted into chants of bring them home. Here, let's have a look at that. See that? This is the Democratic Party. This is my party. And I'm proud as hell of my party right now. It's a big tent, and nobody's going to be happy with everybody in the party all the time. Lord knows I'm not. And yes, there absolutely are horrifying, disgusting levels of anti-Semitism on the horseshoe end of the far left. And yes, unfortunately, some of that has bled into my party, and we need to keep pushing back against it. But for the vast majority of us, it's perfectly possible to both care deeply about Israel's security and recognize the humanity of Palestinian Arabs and want a better life for them. Most of us really don't have a hard time wanting both of those things at the same time, and they really shouldn't be seen as contradictory. The notion that Joe Biden has abandoned Israel because of one sort of out of context, maybe ill-advised half-sentence line in his speech, or the idea that the Democratic Party as a whole has just fallen to some sort of like Corbyn-style jihadist sympathetic fringe. It's just silly. Like Hirsch Goldberg Poland's parents, the vast majority of us are dedicated to being pro-Israel, pro-Palestine, and pro-peace, as opposed to the other party who appear mostly dedicated to being pro-Russia and pro-keeping Trump out of an orange jumpsuit because it would clash horribly with his bronzer. Alright, that's it for this episode of OK Talks. If you like the show and want to make sure not to miss the next episode, be sure to hit subscribe or follow the channel or whatever it's called on whichever platform you're watching or listening. If you really want to do me a solid, please do be sure to hit the like and leave a comment. Most importantly, be sure to share the show with anybody you think might get something out of it. Thanks, as always, to anybody who already has. Thanks in advance to anybody else who will. Thanks, as always, again, to my friend Nate Wright for having designed the podcast artwork, and to everyone else for listening.